Welcome to our speakers and our attendees. We have 4 speakers today that I think everybody would benefit from listening to and hearing perspectives. So I'm going to allow each speaker to introduce themselves and briefly describe what they're about and initiatives that they've participated in that are part of the reasons why we have chosen them to speak today. So the first person I'll speak to is Frank Chikane. Take it away. Just briefly describe yourself and what you engage in and what you intend on speaking about today.
Let me just turn myself on. Thank you very much, Kaeji. I am Frank Chikane. I've played too many roles, so I don't want to waste your time about that. But at present, I'm the moderator of the Churches Commission on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches. And we deal with all conflict areas in the world, from Colombia to Middle East, and I've been in Iraq and other places. So I don't have to bore you about that history, but I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The second person that can introduce themselves is Rudy. Please introduce yourself and explain a bit about yourself to the floor that's here to listen to you today.
Sure. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for participating in this conversation. My name is Rudy Rochman. I'm based out of Jerusalem, born and raised in many different places, lived in the US, lived in France, Singapore, many places throughout my life. But my home has always been Israel. I'm a Jewish rights activist. I fight against anti-Semitism, empower the next generation of Jews for us to write a better next chapter of our history. As we know, previous chapters weren't that great. The work that I do in Israel is uniting different sectors of Israeli society, from the right to the left, religious to secular. And I'm also a part of Habayit, which is a movement that is based of Israelis and Palestinians, for us to be able to create conversations and to create structural change, for us to create a better future within this land that is united on one land.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The next speaker that can introduce themselves is Noam Lubinsky. I'm so sorry for butchering your name. Please, can you correct me?
No, it's absolutely fine. So yeah, hi, I'm Noam. I'm here representing the South African Jews for a Free Palestine, and as well as myself as someone who had an extremely Zionistic upbringing here in Joburg. I'm also somewhat involved in youth education around Joburg, as well as queer politics and queer activism around South Africa.
Thank you. And the last speaker that can introduce themselves is Jamie. Please share a bit about yourself to the floor. And thank you so much for introducing yourself. Cool. Jamie? I'm just trying to find out what's going on.
I think that may be me, and I haven't co-hosted Jamie. Can I?
Oh, have you not given him co-host? Okay.
There, I see him, and I'm enabling that now. My apologies.
Okay, cool. No problem.
My name is Jamie Mighti, and I am a debate coach. I am a podcaster. I host a podcast called the Josie to Lagos podcast, and it fundamentally looks at African affairs. So if people want to listen to some African podcasting content from a policy perspective, the Josie to Lagos podcast does that. I'm also a political analyst. You sometimes see me on different national platforms discussing the current affairs and political issues of the day. I have an LLB from WITS and a business administration degree from WITS Business School. So that's me in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers for introducing themselves. I'll now just go over the basic agenda of today. Okay, so we have broken the general topic of Israel and Palestine up into 5 subtopics that we will be engaging. So the 5 subtopics are what people misunderstand about Israel-Palestine, in what way South Africa's response is unique, the role of the UN, language and media, and having constructive discussions about divisive issues in the high school environment. Okay. So for the first 3 topics, we will begin by addressing our speakers and asking for their opinions on those specific issues for the first 5 minutes. And then the rest of the 10 minutes will be spent on addressing the floor and allowing everybody that's attended to engage with the speakers and express their opinions. So if you want to share an opinion, just use the hands up function and put your hand up, and then you will be unmuted by either me or Sazi, probably Sazi, and you will be able to engage with what the speakers have just said. So that's for the first 3 topics, which is what people misunderstand about Israel-Palestine, the ways in which South Africa's response is unique, and the role of the UN. The last 2 topics, which are language and media and having constructive conversations about divisive issues in a high school environment, will be addressed by the floor first. So we will be solely addressing the floor for those last 2 issues, but speakers are absolutely free to engage in those topics as equals to the floor. And then we're going to end off with a Q&A session that just addresses the general themes that we've discussed today, or any other themes that people might want to bring up. Okay, awesome. With that being said, we will start with the first topic. So the first topic we want to address is what people sorry, the disclaimer. Yikes, that's so important. Sazi's about to give a disclaimer for our talk today. Really, really important. Take it away.
Yes, thank you. So thank you everybody for joining us today. So the ultimate goal of any Crates discussion is for it to be constructive. The conversations had are intended to take what are often contentious issues and unpack them in such a way that allows for every participant to engage outside of this circle with more understanding and more nuance. We've been doing this for a long period of time, and really shout out to Kayedi and Rodin for all that they've been doing. With that being said, today we do have an especially contentious issue and one that has a tendency to be polarizing. So, and I think that's actually perhaps the primary reason why we need to keep this conversation constructive, because there's a lot of talk, especially in the media, and I think generally for people tending to shy away from it because of its complexity. And while I think there needs to be some level of recognizing that this is a complex issue, that can't stop us or that can't paralyze us from engaging. So what does that mean? That means 2 things. Firstly, inflammatory language, hate speech, and any language intended to appeal primarily to emotion or to derail any speaker won't be tolerated. And that includes gaslighting or any rhetoric devices that are not part of a constructive conversation. All speakers especially must be respected, and so too any participants that do choose to share their views. Moreover, any public figure or any state, national state, or any body that is brought into the conversation and spoken about must also be respected, please. Secondly, the conversation must not be derailed. Whether it be through debating factual truths, comparing moral standards, or taking one singular detail and extending it beyond it needs to be, we need to keep this conversation one that is productive at all times. The conversation will be guided by Kayedi and whoever else will mediate through the process, through the prompts that we have for today, and in accordance with the mediator's direction. So please look to the mediator for what they choose to do. These 2 things are in direct antithesis. If we are to derail conversation, or if we are to promote hate speech, they are in direct antithesis to what we are here to do. And anybody who indulges in either of these will be muted or asked to leave. Lastly, I'd like to end off with the terms of engagement, especially from a Zoom point of view. In the interest of safety, the chat will be disabled. If you would like to make a comment when the mediator prompts you to do so, please would you use the raise your hand feature and I will control that. Please, I ask for your patience. As I do that, I promise that I will grant that opportunity. You will not be able to unmute yourself your raised hand will indicate that you would like to speak when you're prompted to do so. And lastly, the host, being myself, reserves the right to mute any participant if necessary or remove them from the meeting. There's also no function, it has been disabled for you to share your screen, but please can I ask that no visuals be used, because those, especially in a recorded video and just with a large audience, do have a tendency, especially if they're not accounted for beforehand, to have the conversation go a different way, but also to directly instigate offense. So please, those are the terms of engagement and the disclaimer. That being said, none of that is intended to stop this being an interactive event. I think one of the things COVID has taken away from us is that the interactive element to crates, and we want to preserve that. So I'm going to try, and we're all going to try keep that and maintain that as best as is possible. But obviously, in light of this issue itself, but also the nature of an online platform, we have to ensure that it's secure and safe for everybody involved. So with that, Kaedi, I'm gonna hand over to you. Kaedi is having difficulty with her camera, so please do excuse that. Thank you.
Hi, okay, so now onto the topic we'll be discussing. We're going to try and be quick about this because today, well, it's Friday today, so there's the Shabbat for like a lot of people that are attending that we have to bear in mind. So we'll jump right into this. Okay, cool. So the first topic we wanted to unpack was what people misunderstand about Israel-Palestine, okay? And this is, we've left the questions fairly open and generalistic because we want both speakers and the floor to be able to interpret them as they wish. So the first person I'll be directing this statement at is Reverend Frank Chikane. Please take it away. What do you believe people misunderstand about Israel-Palestine?
You make me feel I'm back at school, and if your surname starts with a C, the inspector called you first. You know? No, let me just say quickly, because I was told it's 5 minutes. I failed to say to you that I've been engaged with the matter of Israel-Palestine for a long time. In the 80s up to date, I've visited the area. I've gone on both sides of Israel and Palestine, talked to the leaders. We had delegations coming to South Africa when I was in government to try to engage them. So it's an old subject. Let me just say what people misunderstand about Israel-Palestine. Firstly, the history is complex. So the history itself tends to be interpreted in many ways. You will never have one interpretation. And when it goes into the area of Zionism and history and prophecy and all that, it becomes even more complicated. I tend to simplify this matter, and I would like to state that it is not a religious conflict. So anybody who thinks it's a religious conflict must pack that away. Secondly, especially for Christians, because I come from that, so it's not a Muslim-Jewish conflict in religious terms. Those who are Christian, they tend to think it's a Christian-Muslim conflict. It is a false analysis because amongst Palestinians than they are amongst Jewish communities in Israel. And the statistics are there. So it's not also a Christian-Muslim issue. The issue tends to history in terms of what happened to Europe, etc., etc. I think the issue for now is whether or not the right have right to live and rights and all rights. It can't be one group against another. And the thing that's really misunderstood in my is the issue about occupation. If you have people occupied, there are international laws about occupation, and people miss that. And some people forget that people fight for 50. I met a 48-year-old in 2015 in Jerusalem who said, I was born occupied, I'm still occupied, I have no rights. And so it's an issue of rights rather than differences between people. And lastly, the last thing I want to say is that in the past, it used to be the right to exist and whether Israel has got the right to exist. We crossed that path, that road with the agreement which gave birth to this two. I wanted the names and all that. It will take time, and so it's no more the question about whether anybody rights. It's the question of whether people have the right to govern themselves in their own territories. You become one. In the beginning, people used to stay together in Palestine and live together, both Jews and Palestinians or Arabs or whatever you call people, in one place and are equal. I think from this point, it's more about justice for all, and that justice is not divisible. It must be available to everybody. Let me stop at that here.
Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. The next person I'm going to direct the question to is the question is, what do you think people misunderstand about Israel and Palestine?
Sure. So I think one of the main things people misunderstand is they think that there is going to be a future where one will succeed and one will. The reality is, as long as one suffers, both there's no reality where either Palestinians disappear and either Israelis disappear. So their activism, their work, their efforts to turn people against, not saying ships, I'm not saying criticizing the actual peoples, they're doing it in both. Another big misconception is that we're talking about Israel and Palestine. It's the same. We're talking about one piece of land from the river to the sea. Palestinians call it Palestine, Jews call it Israel. It's the same land. It really doesn't matter what we call it. Some people used to call it Judea, some people call it the Levant, some people used to call it Canaan. It really doesn't matter what the name is, but we're talking about one piece of land. Yes, it's divided today, it's divided with a wall, but all those things, the majority collect, and they don't see this land as a piece of territory. They see it as their soulmate. So for it is something that most Israelis and most Palestinians disagree. And most Palestinians two-state solution, it's only order to have that kind of eventually to live access on the rest, which I believe in, that we should all have no more walls to be able to access this land. Another thing that a lot of people get wrong is they don't understand who the Jews are and what our connection is to that land. Now, they think that Judaism is a religion, but a religion is a belief system in a God, deity, book, or a prophet. So if you don't believe in Jesus, you're not a Christian. If you don't believe in the Quran or in Muhammad, you're not a Muslim. If you don't believe in the philosophies of Buddha, you're not a Buddhist. Jesus, you become a Christian. You accept Muhammad, you become a Muslim. You accept the philosophies of Buddha, you become a Buddhist. And so in Judaism, even if you reject the Torah, you're still very much so a Jew. And in order for someone to become a Jew, they don't just accept the belief system, but they have to go through a long process in order to become part of a nation, a civilization, identity, a language, a connection to a history, a value system, the suffering that comes along with it. And it's actually very similar to other native peoples around the world. The Maoris have spirituality. The Native Americans have spirituality, the Kurds, the Aboriginals all have spiritual elements of their culture. And if one doesn't agree or believe in that element, that doesn't take away their identity. And they also have similar ways in which one can join their collective nation, almost identical to the process of quote unquote conversion to the Jewish people. So it's first important to understand that we are the descendant of a native indigenous population from Judea that existed prior to the colonization of Judea colonized by the Romans, renamed the land to Palestine. And for 2,000 years, this land has been called Palestine. The Palestinians are sort of a hybrid ethnic group where a lot of them, 30 to 60% of their ancestors are actually Jews that converted to Christianity or Islam and eventually became part of a newer identity called Palestinian, and also a percentage of them came from Arabia. And so they're a mixed hybrid group that is also fundamentally connected to this land, sees their land as their home, connects to Jerusalem on a very deep level, very similar to the Jewish people. And I think one of the biggest things that we got wrong is that we tend to superimpose each other's definition of identity onto each other, rather than an understanding that we both connect to this land, we both have a connection to this land, and are or they don't live on this land, or when people try to use terms like colonizers or settlers, or any sort of term that makes the Jewish people seem foreign, as if we are from abroad. Neither the Palestinians nor the Jews are from abroad. We are both from this land. A new Palestinian village is called a Palestinian village. A new Jewish village is called a Jewish village. Neither of them are settlements. So settlements are when the British came to America, when the British came to other places. Those were foreign nations coming into lands that did not belong to them. The Jewish people always had a constant presence in the land, and some of us were forcibly displaced, and eventually we came back and kicked out the British of our land, which actually represents the most successful decolonization movement. The problem is that the British at the same time did the same to us.
Your standings of Judaism, as they are quite different from mine as a South African Jew. I fully agree that Judaism is different. There is a form of ethnicity that is linked to a Jewish identity that perhaps is not linked to, let's say, a Christian identity. That being said, I think that to say that all Jews from Israel or from Palestine or from that piece of land is somewhat reductive. I can trace my lineage very clearly to Lithuania and to Germany. I cannot so much so do that for Israel, right? And we have the science to say that most probably majority of Jews do not come from Israel. I also think that this is important then because as an Ashkenazi Jew, my claim to right of return is often thought of most specifically even perhaps before the Jews that have always lived in Palestine, right? Even before Mizrahi Jews, who in their own ways have suffered under a largely Ashkenazi rule. But that being said, so clearly this is a complex question, it's a complex issue. And so it's very important for us to have deep, in-depth discussions about it as we are right now. That being said, I think that if there's ever a situation where there is a deep power imbalance between two people or between two powers, be that the Israeli powers and the Palestinian people, or even, as we'll discuss the connections to South Africa in a bit, be that between the National Party and Black people in Bantustans, I think what we have to understand is however complex a situation is, we can very clearly see a difference of death tolls here, right? We can very clearly see one side that has time and time again been extremely well funded by America, and because of that has been able to create an iron dome, which means that even if bombs are fired towards Israel, they most of the time do not land, versus a side that has almost no self-sovereignty, a side which, if you look at Gaza, Gaza has been called the largest open-air prison in the world, and we know through like so many human rights organizations going and looking again and again, that the lives of Palestinians, specifically in Gaza, but as also the West Bank, is unlivable. They do not have fresh water, they do not have hospitals, they do not have access to a livable life, and this is because of an Israeli occupation. And so while I agree that there can be complexities, and I will speak specifically to this idea of settlements on rights, we have to also look at the fact that even under the land that was given as part of the original agreement, Israelis have continually been encroaching on what was supposed to be Palestinian land. I know this as someone with cousins who are illegal settlers in the West Bank. We have to look at the fact that continually the Israeli Defense Force has been terrorizing the Palestinian people. We know this because even though the we know this because the IDF is trained not to kill, but to shoot to maim, to ensure a debilitated Palestinian people. And we know this, again, just by looking purely at the difference in the quality of life between people in Gaza and, let's say, people in Tel Aviv. I agree that this is a complex issue, but I also think that we all agree here that there is one side of this that has been significantly oppressed and one side that is doing the oppression. Yeah, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight. And the last person I'm going to direct this question at is Jamie.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think what I'll start off by mentioning is I think a lot of people don't appreciate that there have been prior peace deals entered into and land swaps entered into between Israel and a variety of different actors, but those dynamics are now more difficult. I'm going to explain a little bit what I'm talking about just now, but it's relevant, I think, to mention this and to bring it up because the challenge now, I think, for some people is as they follow the conversation and as they follow the complexity, and I think it's fine to have complicated conversations, irregardless of the fact that they are complex and we shouldn't shy away from them. But some people then begin to think about resolution. They begin to think about the way forward. So we've heard Reverend Chikane talk about a suggestion that they be a one-party state, and Rudy seems also to be suggesting a one-party state. So just to give some context and some background, in 1947, you have the UN Partition Plan. In 1948, You have the Declaration of Independence by Israel. There's an Arab-Israeli War in 1948, which ends in 1949. And then there's the Six-Day War in 1967. After the Six-Day War, Israel took control of the Sinai, the Golan Heights, Gaza. They took control of the West Bank in terms of just as the war ended. In 1978, Israel was able to enter into a peace agreement with Egypt, and Anwar Sadat signed that peace agreement. And in the signing of the peace agreement with Egypt, the Sinai was returned to Egypt. So that for me is an interesting example in the history of this conflict, wherein there was a resolution on a question of land. The same can be said about the Oslo Accords, the first Oslo Accords, wherein you had Yitzhak Rabin, you had Shimon Peres, you had Fatah, represented by Yasser Arafat at the time. They were able to come together, have a conversation around how to arrange, territorial issues. And the Oslo Accords became the result of that. And if you are not familiar with the Oslo Accords, what they did is that they separated, or they demarcated the West Bank into three areas: Area A, Area B, Area C. A is the control of the Palestinian Authority, Area B, which is also under the control of the Palestinian Authority, but with Israeli security, and Area C, which is more controlled by Israel. And that's where the question of whether you want to call them villages or settlements actually predominantly arises from. And the settlers themselves moved into that 1967. It's quite an interesting point in history to be aware of if you are wondering, where does a lot of our modern discussion stem from? It stems from that Six-Day War and the developments that flowed from that. But for me, what's interesting is that there were people willing to meet, to have the discussions. And as I said to you, in 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed, you had Yitzhak Rabin, you had Shimon Peres, and in 1978, you had Anwar Sadat. However, what's provoking for me in terms of looking at pathways towards peace is that every time a deal was signed, there was a consequence for the people who signed the deal. And some of the dynamics that are now modern include radicalization. But let me elucidate what I'm talking about. After the signing of the peace accord in 1978, the Egyptian leader, Anwar Sadat, was actually assassinated, in part because of signing a deal with Israel. And then in 1994, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the leader in Israel, was also assassinated by an extremist because of having signed a deal with Yasser Arafat. And since then, there hasn't really been a successful deal entered into, even though the demarcations and the paperwork has widely circulated in the international diplomatic community. And part of that is because after Oslo, more radical leaders stepped into the fray, and more radical leaders began to dominate the narrative. And I mean radical in terms of diplomatic engagement. So on the Israeli side, you had Benjamin Netanyahu, who was actually quite opposed to the signing of the Oslo Accords in the first instance in 1993, and he rose to prominence. But also on the Palestinian side, what happened is that Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, which make up the Palestinian Authority, they did not continue to gain public support. And public support has now shifted towards Hamas. It has also shifted to the Palestinian Jihad and groups which are more extremist in nature. So when it comes to a resolution of the fundamental issues that are in the dispute, I wonder personally whether or not the particular leaders of the different stakeholders can actually do that. So even though there's international community pressure, and even though there are a lot of the dynamics that have been discussed now, there still remains a question of, can the radicalization of the discourse be reversed to a point where you have people in the room with enough goodwill and diplomatic intent to enter into agreements that do begin to create better lives for all of the people who are affected by the ongoing disputes. So that's where I would like to end it as a starting point.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that engagement. Because of time reasons, we have opened the chat function so that people can engage by text as the speakers speak, so that they can still be that level of engagement. We're going to move on to the next question. So as the speakers are speaking, you can use the chat function to make comments. And we're going to try and open it up to the floor after this next section of questions. So the next topic we'll be addressing is the ways in which South Africa's response is unique. Okay, and the first person I'm going to ask this question to, since we've just spoken to him, is Jamie. In what ways do you think South Africa's response to this entire thing is unique?
Well, I think that South Africa has a special role in the intellectual consideration of this question, because obviously there was apartheid in South Africa from 1948 up until 1994, depending on where you want to end the discussion of when it ended. Some may say, it started ending to 90. Reverend Chikane can speak, I think. So I think South Africa occupies a special role in the conversation because of the lived experience of apartheid, and it is the example. I think what's curious to note, though, is that in international law, the definition of apartheid expands from the South African experience, and there's been debate now as to, whether or not those new definitions, the direct comparison should just be to South Africa in terms of as an analogy or standing off the experience. So in that way, I think it is unique. And South Africa's voice is quite prominent in this topic. And I think of President Ramaphosa when he was speaking, to 24, as well as in the letter that he wrote, do resonate throughout the global community, because he can speak from a position of being an ANC leader, from a position of someone who lived through apartheid, and also just unique. But there's debate around the academic definitions of apartheid, but I think that we may not have time for that. But I think that would be my answer to that specific question.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. The next question, next I'm going to direct this question at an alternative way you can answer this question is, what is your view on the characterization of the actions of the Israeli state as apartheid? So that's an alternative way you can answer this question, Rudy. Take it away.
And there's also a few different points I want to touch on things that were said before. The role of anyone in the international community. South Africa, I've never been there. I was actually supposed to travel right before Corona, but Corona canceled my flight. So I can't speak on behalf of South Africans, but as someone living in this land that my children will be, that has lost friends in this war, and hopefully, B'ezrat Hashem, will never have to lose anybody on either side in this conflict. What I say is that the people abroad, they should be using their energy to Israelis and Palestinians, and not taking one side and being against the other. Because if you're pro-Israel but anti-both, and if you're pro-anti-Israel, you're anti-both, because there's no reality where either will exist. So in terms of the term apartheid, at the end of the day, when we say sounds that come out of our mouths that are considered words, they sound what they mean. And apartheid as one country, one government, one dominant group that has different rights for different peoples based on skin color with the South African experience. In Israel, as we discussed, you have different territories. You have Gaza, which is under Hamas. You have the Palestinian Authority, which controls the entirety of Area A, but partly. You have Israel that controls Israel. You have Israel that controls Area C. So you have a division of land, which is a complete failure of the Oslo Accord, which is why I'm completely against the Oslo Accord and the division of land and the fact that we need to segregate ourselves and everything else. But it doesn't fit the definition because you have different territories, different sovereignties, and you have rights based on where you live. So I, as a Jewish Israeli, cannot go into Area A. I don't have rights there. I cannot go into Gaza. I don't have rights there. And Palestinians that are living in Gaza cannot go into Israel. They don't have rights there. Palestinians living in area A can only get permits or another type of permit. So there is a of movement on people and what sovereignty they fall in, which is something we need to fight against. But it's very dangerous to use terms which define something completely different, which is, I think, the main thing that most people need to understand. It's not only about learning the what, it's also learning the why. Because if we don't understand why we're even here in the first is really going on, then the what of only one side doesn't matter. So a few things that I wanted to talk before of indigeneity and of Judaism as a form of indigeneity is on blood quantum. It's not based on how much percentage of DNA you have. However, Ashkenazi DNA is Levantine DNA. It's proven genetic. Of course, for marriages, of course, there was assimilation. Of course, there were forced rapes. The fact who are the community that had an experience in Europe, a displaced experience where they were never even considered Europeans and massacred and exterminated for never being white in white society, and continuously targeted in white societies for not being white, even though their skin may usually be more paler than other Jewish experiences. We are still indigenous to this land. So it's like kind of saying someone who's has a black parent, that the kid can identify as black. So because some of us had been raped, or some of us were intermarried, or some of people converted, the way indigeneity works is the continuation of a collective identity that is indigenous to the land. And people are indigenous because they belong to a collective, not because the individual is indigenous. It's the other way around. So I think it's very dangerous, again, also to use colonial definitions onto the Jewish people, such as the word religion, which is the way that Christianity sees their way of life, or other things that was only an experience for Ashkenazi Jews until 48, such as considering ourselves Orthodox, conservative, or even Sephardi Jews, like that were living in Morocco and Algeria, and did not identify ever as Orthodox, conservative, or Reform, and experience outside of the because they started to implement definitions how to identify and how to see their own community based on what living in amongst colonizers of the world, which were Europeans at the time. But one thing that was addressed that I do about was death. 1%, there should not be 1% dying. And it's very dangerous to use death as sort of petition to attack one against the other, to make one more legitimate. Or the reality on the ground, the why things are happening, is that there's been from this, the president of the 16th year of his supposed to have an election this week. All of a sudden, because of this conflict, this war, there's no talk of an election. Hamas, which was not the favored party in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, today is, because of their strong fight against Israel today, and they're now seen as sort of the fighters against Israeli army. So they're now seen as the likely candidates to win if there were ever another election in America. And also Bibi Netanyahu, with the Israeli government, that are benefiting. We're now on our 4th election, soon probably going to a 5th, and there was supposed to be a different coalition built that would take Bibi out of power, and all of a sudden, no one's thinking about that anymore. So I think we need to figure out who's really profiting from this conflict. It's not the civilians on either side. It's not the collectives on either side. We can also put blame on US weapon companies with foreign aid, which I'm completely against, profits from this conflict. We can put blame on NGOs that all profit. We can put blame on medias that try to pin people against each other, but it's not the people's. Now, what is happening with the death tolls? What started is that, before we can talk about Shekhinah and all the things that happened before as well, but let's talk about what's happening in Gaza. Hamas shoots rockets at 2 civilians. I've been, for the past 2 weeks, going into bomb shelters and hearing explosions outside. And even hearing a friend of mine who lost a friend of his from what's been going on. Even Israeli Arabs have been killed from what's going on here with the rocket fire. So it's not just rockets that are being stopped by the Iron Dome, and I will never be sorry for the fact that we learn to find ways to minimize our death. The reality is that Hamas is shooting rockets from civilian areas, intentionally from places where there are hospitals. There was a comment made that there are no hospitals, but there are plenty of hospitals. They shoot rockets from schools, from hospitals, from civilian places. And when Israel fires back, they warn the region. They call the people living there. They text message them. They send out the drone with leaflets written in Arabic saying, we are going to attack this specific structure because they're shooting rockets from that structure. That's why we need to have a targeted strike on that structure to remove those people and to remove that rocket launcher. So no more rockets are shooting onto our civilians. And they warn the people. And there's even something called.
Hi, Rudy. Because of the Shabbat, I'm going to have to ask. Summarize.
Can I make 1 minute final? Sure.
No okay,
problem.
Just so I can.
No problem. One last minute. There's a context to why things are happening, and people are taking out the context and talking about numbers. Now, again, I said that one person dying is bad, but the reason people are dying is about Hamas is placing civilians in those locations and forcing them to be there. So we can, if one truly cares Palestinians dying, which for me, Palestinians are cousins, okay, then we have to understand why they're dying in the first place in order to stop it, for the what to stop. And it's very important. And I think the biggest problem to end it with is to put this narrative oppressed that side. It's a fact that on the day-to-day life, those living in Israel versus Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, Palestinians experience more oppression. But overall, oppression is experienced sides, and it's not one side is good, one side is bad. It's the system, and it's the system that has to be changed. And as long as we don't have a conversation and coming together, go out that system, this is only going to continue. So the advice that I would give to the country, anyone living outside, is to use your energy to talk, but not to pin it as better or good or bad, but that both sides are suffering in different ways. And the only way to continue and to move forward is for that suffering to end on both sides.
Okay, so thank you. The next person I'm going to address this question to is Noam. Please share your view on this.
Sure.
I'll repeat the question if need be.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Sure. So I'm going to spend hopefully a minute just to respond to some of the things that have been said, and then I'll go on to specifically discussing Israel in this. Again, I'd really love to have an hour, if not many hour-long conversations around Jewish and what Judaism has to do with indigenous, etc., etc. I think it's a very important discussion. I think it's very important to this conversation. However, I don't think we have time for that now. The one thing I do with discussion, though, is early Zionist or proto-Zionist thinkers did not even necessarily think that a Jewish state had to be in the Palestinian land. In fact, there were thoughts of moving it into Uganda or to Alaska or many other places, right? And so, though we can all agree that there are many important places in that area for religion, I think saying there's important places to a specific group and assuming that everyone in that group has an innate right to that place are separate things. The other thing I just want to Africa in particular is that, sure, we know in any conflict there are going to be hardship felt by everyone. That is the nature of conflict. However, we also, as you said, know that there are systems of oppression that make that conflict more deeply felt for one side, right? So we know that in South Africa, facing systematic femicide. We know that men are primarily the perpetrators. We also know that men in some way are hurt by patriarchy. It doesn't mean that are the victims of femicide. In the same way, I'm very happy to say that both Israelis and Palestinians are hurt by a system of oppression. I believe that who are forced into service live with PTSD in a way that irrevocably changes how many people who live in Israel live their entire lives. However, that doesn't change the fact that, as I said before, there is one that is disproportionately affected by this. Anyway, let me talk about specifically. So now let me talk about South Africa in particular, right? we want to talk about apartheid, we can look very specifically at the definitions of settler colonialism and ways in which Palestinians have been continually shoved out of their land. We can look at the way in which there are of discrimination against Palestinians by this state and how they simply do not have citizenship. We can look, as we've been discussing, at the ways in which Gaza, different zones are in some way sovereign, but in many ways entirely beholden to the Israeli state. And we can understand that perfectly well throughout the state and through know very well what it looks like to be a state within a state that apparently has autonomy, but when it comes down to it, when it comes to who's actually recognized, what we have is an impressive government that is in control, right? So as much as we can maybe sort of speak about a Gazan sovereignty, this would be very similar to speaking about sovereignty in Bantustan. And this is why, as South Africa, even if we want to debate kind of what words we want to use for these things, I think that the similarities are striking. And I therefore think that we are in a very particularly good place to understand what's happening in Israel because of these similarities. I also think that even if we think about today and what happens with South Africans and Israel today, we see that much military training, much weaponry that is used both against South African protesters as well as American protesters are civilian based, meaning, civilian tested, meaning they have been tested by using them against Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. And so that system of oppression moves this way as well, right? In a way that the South African Defense Force then uses Israeli occupied forces, military tactics and weapons to support oppression here. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that perspective. I'm going to address this question to you is Reverend Frank Chikane. I'll repeat the question. In what way do you think South Africa's response is unique?
Yeah, at last, Gaeji, I think I've listened after my
I give you a chance to do Lars.
After my short comment at the beginning, when I didn't use all the time, I listened to the panelists. I must say, besides Jami, because went the analytic route about the negotiations and things, which I appreciate. But I thought from the first, Noam and Rudy, after this meeting, we should meet. We've got a solution for Israel, for the help facilitate. Because if you start from every right to leave that place, then that ends the conflict, because people who live together like we do in South Africa, everybody live together with whites in this country peacefully. There are many problems, but nobody thought we could, but we did. So I thought we'd go that route. But when we went to you can see where the difficulties are. So I would like to say, as my start from that I've said before, my first visit there in 1988 was hosted by the Israeli government, spent 2 days, and went into the occupied territories, hosted by the Palestinian Authority there for 2 days. And they said, I must make up my mind about the situation. So I have to sum it up this way for many people now. Anybody would be subject to the Gaza experience. You lock them up, put up on the seaside, you blockade it, you can't go so many meters away. and food and everything is controlled from the occupying force. You pay taxes, and the taxes are held by the occupying force, and they decide when they give you your tax or they don't give your tax. If you pay them, they don't give you the money. If you are put within that 42 miles by 8, I think, you will behave like people in Gaza. They will be ballistic and do anything, even if they get killed, because there's no life there. I think we should turn it around and say, if the Israelis were subjected to what Gaza is subjected to, suppose a power from Mars comes here and subjects them under the same condition, they will because it's the condition. Come to the subject of apartheid. The realities that I agree, Rudy would said so on Noam, it's the British left us with, they left Palestine and then got this arrangement, which was imposed on the local people. And then as a state created, and you had to accept the existence of that state, and people to be beaten up to accept that. And then once you have accepted it, you end up with an Oslo Accord that divides it, like apartheid here in South Africa. And we opposed that. We said, but this is apartheid. But they said that's the only solution. The issue of apartheid. I studied this matter. I'm doing a lecture in Bethlehem in the Evangelical College there on this particular matter of it. There I've met Arab Israelis, Palestinians who are in Israel, who are treated in terms of the law in Israel differently. Even those who are in the Knesset. And there is a decision by the Knesset last year, I think, or a year before last, which actually defines those who are not Jews by definition outside of this. And so if you start from there, I've met the Knesset members who are Palestinian. Then I've met Palestinians who didn't live in 1948 or 7, who lived there, but I tried the law look at us. And then I met Palestinians, 5 of them, who live in different parts of the occupied area. The one is in Israel side, treated from the others. There are laws where you walk. And then when they set up a settlement, an illegal settlement in terms of the law, they create roads where Palestinians can't drive. There are walkways where you walk this side of the fence and not the other side. And there are studies that have been made, and now there are 3 authentic studies that shows that what is happening in Israel-Palestine, I call it Israel-Palestine, doesn't matter what you call it, because I call it as one place. Shows very clearly people are governed in terms of their identity, and therefore defines it as apartheid. I said that, and I got clobbered. The stories are powerful. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So we cannot run away from the fact that Israel as a state is law out system, put it as system. They are practicing it there. We lived in this situation, and I've gone there, I saw it. I mean, there are refugees who are still refugees today who can't return to their houses. One of them went to save, the people in Israel went to show me houses where they were taken away from and could not return to their houses. Now it's happening in Jerusalem. So you can't have a system like that and have peace. I believe both the Jewish community there and the Palestinians, call them whatever you call them, must have to live together, and they must be equal before the law and treated the same. You can't create a situation where we get foreigners in South Africa, they qualify to be South Africans. You get foreigners in the United States, they qualify to be citizens. If you get laws, you cannot be citizen here. Entity that finds you as an apartheid system. And so what is the role of South Africa? I am convinced that we understand better as South Africans, and we can see when something is unjust, that this thing is just. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And I have said to both my friends, I've gone to meet them, to have peace is to make sure the Palestinians are treated the same as a Jew in Israel. If you do that, there will be peace, there will be no terror. By the way, just to end, Kaiji, I don't have the idea that there were terrorists there and terrorists there. I was called a terrorist. I was detained under the Terrorism Act. I was tortured thoroughly. Calling people terrorists, it's people who are in power who define who can use force. They legitimize force if you are powerful. Unless you respond to the force, you become a terrorist. And that definition, for me, it's a problem. Thank you, man.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that engagement. So a bit of admin that Sazi and I have to do. We've opened the chats and there's a lot of comments we need to address. The first is with the speaker changes. So I had made an announcement of who the initial speakers were going to be, but there had been changes that had happened the day. So Iman Musa is listening in right now. I opted to not speak. However, she did recommend Lubinsky, and he is a very qualified speaker that recommended herself. But otherwise, she is present here in this chat and listening, and that's just addressing the questions people had about speakers specifically. So I want to reiterate some of our policies regarding maintenance of dialogue. Sazi, are you?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Kairi. I'm happy to. Everybody, clearly the chat is facilitating a completely different discussion. And I think Kairi and I curated the discussion through the prompts, obviously for a particular purpose, because that is how we felt that engagement, it was the best way through which engagement could happen. And I thank our speakers because I think they have given us a lot to work with and some really good analysis. And I think that partly reflects in the response in the chat. But I do just want to reiterate, if we could please reserve the chat for conversations around the prompts and especially the points that arise from the speaker's response to the prompts. I think the prompts give a comprehensive outline of what we want to achieve from this conversation. So I do ask that can we please keep the conversation in the chat tailored toward what is in the prompts. Moreover, we are going to move in terms of audience interaction. Then the disclaimer becomes a lot more pertinent because that is then a vocalized statement. So can I please then reiterate that any inflammatory or hate language or any gaslighting of any form is actually very counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve. And so we ought to prevent that in all cases. And please, can I ask that not form part of our conversation? I don't think it has a place. Above and beyond that, please let's not get derailed in our conversation. We want it to be productive and we want it to be constructive, and focusing and honing in on little things that may exist in fact or people may have a set viewpoint on doesn't actually serve in the broader scheme of the conversation to advance it. So again, please, I ask for your cooperation. We want to make this constructive and meaningful, both in the chat and in actual vocal engagement. So please, for your cooperation in that regard. Otherwise, if the conversation spirals, then something will have to have been done by that, or have to be done because of that. So yeah, please, can I ask that we adhere and cooperate with those?
Thank you. And I was told to bring this up. The Shabbat, so I've been advised to remind attendees from King David that it has started. And being said, we'll continue with the conversation with remaining attendees. So we're going to open the floor, as you mentioned, and we'll begin by, we were going to address the topic about the role of the UN, but the sense is that has been addressed in some data by our speakers. So we'll move on to the next question, which I think is coincidentally relevant in terms of like the chat discussions happening. Next topic we want to address is media language. So basically want to engage with the floor and panelists alike about what they feel should be our approach to addressing this issue on the media and the language cues we should be using. So this has been brought up throughout the topic by different speakers, certain language used in terms of the region and how we'd, I guess, the different people that exist within the region. Terminology like terrorists has been addressed by today. So that broad aspect being said, I'd just like to open it up to the hands up function. I'm seeing that already a few hands up, Sazi. You can select people whose hands are up.
Okay, thank you, Kaede. I will do that. You should see something asking you to unmute yourself, and please do keep it relatively brief. Ivan,
hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thank you, Sazi. So first, I'd just like to thank for coming and a sensitive matter. I think that when it comes to the language of this conflict, and even of this conflict generally, that controversial as this is, I believe that both sides are being blatantly manipulated by the government and by their semantics. Ultimately, both the government of Israel, particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, Hamas, are both, largely speaking, are bereft with problems. And for the most part, using words of occupation, terrorist over and over again. What they ultimately serve to do solely is just drive not only that division, but by galvanizing both their Palestinian and Israeli fighting and disliking each other, when in reality they should be working together to mutually of what can only be described as some of the most incredible man. Thus, I believe that the most effective way to deal with the conflict is to simply treat both the governments of Palestine and Israel as equals, in the sense that both are fanning the flames of the conflict in their own self-interests. So, anyone really could live together. As every speaker, we have not had a single speaker say that a Jew or an Arab, an Israeli or a Palestinian live together cohesively. And the only thing really preventing that is rhetoric of, oh, they're going to kill us all, regardless of who actually says that or regardless who that all is. If we were to simply change that narrative, be able to live with one another easily. And so conclusively, the only reason we still have they're all going to kill us is simply because both sides wish to stay in, and fighting each other keeps them both sides divided. When united, both could easily live in peace. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll next speaker, Sazi.
Hi everyone. I just want to thank Noam, Jamie, and Rudy, and Reverend Frank Chikane for having this conversation. I think as a debating coach, it's a very difficult subject to teach, and I think your inputs have been quite valuable. I just wanted, in terms of the language the media were talking about, I would like, in terms of just the US involvement, not historically even, but at this point. And I think the media has been very, I think, clinical in the way how the US is aiding Israel, and the lack of responses we've got from the Joe Biden administration. So I think it might be useful for our students, especially because I know we had this conversation in debating. What is your perspective on the way the media has been covering the US involvement, and the US has, in my opinion, helped fuel the violence? So that's my question for all the panelists. Thank you.
Would one specific panelist like to take that question? Actually, perhaps Kayedi, you want to channel, perhaps you can have 2 quick responses to that question. And when I say quick, please do keep it rather brief, and then we can look to advance the conversation from there. So I mean, Kayedi, I can leave that in your hands.
Yeah, I think 2 panelists is perfectly fine. Rudy, I saw you put your hand up. How would you want to engage with what Irene has said? And Jamie, okay, cool. 2 panelists.
I absolutely agree with what she's saying. You know, there are different forms of colonization in which take control of the world. Back in the countries used to come, invade with their army and plant their flags and change the language and take the resources. Today, other countries like America make different countries reliable on their military. So the US foreign aid that is given to Israel is not foreign aid authority. So all the countries in the region, they also give it to Egypt, they also give it really a lot of countries are dependent on US military weapons. Cash is not its credit to US weapon industries and companies, making Israel dependent on the weapons of America and making it profitable for America for the new, because it continues to use that credit to find companies. And also America basically what to do. If Israel wanted to do something to move out of this conflict, then they'd be able to stop. So I think the involvement of the US is very toxic. I'm not against the idea of a country called the US. I grew up most of my life, a lot of time there. I went to Columbia University there. I'm thankful for my experiences there. However, involvement of the United States in the Middle East is completely toxic, and the use of foreign aid is used to allow war to continue in order to benefit the politicians, medias, NGOs, or weapon companies, and definitely not the people on the line.
Yeah, I just wanted to say quickly around perspectives from, I think that there were some quality takes that came from the media, and there was a lot of good quality of reporting in terms of what was happening. And I think Al Jazeera interesting content specifically when the building was being bombed. But there's a challenge that exists in discussions in global media, and the challenge exists because journalists who get platform are not neutral. You come on CNN to get platform on a lot of the big networks. You have relationships with those particular franchises, and what you find is that oftentimes it creates silos and echo chambers as opposed to quality platforms for conversation. And so that's always a challenge. And also the PR industry, which is around discussions of this nature, is quite vast. It also affects the quality of the conversation. And the challenge that exists beyond just this particular topic, a variety of topics. And I think one thing that can be said is that the American media, they were not as aggressive in holding Joe Biden to account and getting questions from him and answers from him in due time. I think that was reflected when he was doing that. He was driving a Ford and they were asking him questions whilst he was doing his car drive. I was like, no, I'm not going to answer. Everyone was laughing and all of that. And it wasn't a good reflection on me as a whole, that they were not able to hold a global leader to account, and the conversation was flowing. So that's what I want to say about that.
Thank you. Sazi, Why don't you allow me to speak now? Sorry. Okay, so.
Okay, thank you, Kayedi. We will take 2 more hands in terms of audience engagement on this specific issue, and then we will move on to our next prompt. Now, I mean, I I plead with you to bear with me because I have I have a very little sense of who to permit and who not to, but I do just want to reiterate what was said in the disclaimer. And please, can you keep all engagement pertinent to the topic and respectful? Yeah, thank you. I am going to enable somebody to speak now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I actually had a question for Rudy regarding something that he said earlier. He mentioned that happening in Israel is not apartheid because Palestinians in the West Bank are a sovereign authority. I would just ask what he would say to the fact within the West Bank, Israel controls all of it. They have a military occupation over all of it. As of now, there's not Palestinian. And even Palestinians Bank, regardless of they're in area A, B, or C, every single Palestinian in the West Bank pays taxes to the state of which they are not citizens of. And in turn, Israel gives the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority has municipal kind of powers, but much. So I find it really kind of misleading to suggest that Israel is not the government in the West Bank. It most definitely is. And the fact that a Israeli settler can live in the West Bank as a complete citizen of the state of Israel, they can vote in elections, they can pay taxes, they will have, swimming pools. Meanwhile, Palestinians who live across the street are not citizens of the state that controls them. Oftentimes have access to running water and cannot vote in these elections for the that controls them, the Israeli government. I think the notion of subjecting two different peoples to two different sets of laws in the same place is literally a definition of apartheid. And when Desmond Tutu went to the West, who won a Nobel Prize for fighting apartheid, he said, when I go, he said, there's no doubt in my mind that Israel's an apartheid. And he said, well, I see a mirror image of what I faced under apartheid. So my question for Rudy is, how can you kind of deny that kind of apartheid reality that exists there? And would you accept the idea, would you accept the fact that Israel is the sovereign authority in the West Bank, and these Palestinians are paying taxes to the state of Israel? Their movement is being controlled by Israeli soldiers, and they are essentially ruled over a government in which they are not citizens of. Jewish people, Israelis who live in that same area, are full of that state.
Hamza, sorry to cut you off. We're just time. Okay, I'll just let Rudy respond. Sorry, I'm seeing that you're done. Thank you for sharing that question. Thank you.
There was a lot said there, and I do appreciate the passion there, because you clearly care about Palestinians like I do. Think that there's a lot about the group and subject that people can find a solution understanding. Plenty of South African activists, political figures, leaders that have to this land, and have also said that it's not a state. You're talking about the system being complete, and a lot of the things that you said about the system being unjust, I agree. The system needs to. The accords are a failure. The is a failure. There's division of land. I don't want one wall. I don't want one checkpoint. I don't want one land. I think soldiers be used to protect armed countries and not used to control populations. And I think if there is a security force in the West Bank, Jordan, it should be a security force that represents the local people, that is elected by the local people, that is representative of the local people, and not currently what we have today. So to talk about the element is, at the end of the day, what's most important, because we live with the reality. So let's talk the specific, which you mentioned some of them, in order to change them, rather than trying to equate this situation to another situation in order to make one side bad and one side good, which is also what I kind of noticed you do. You use the settler, which you might agree or disagree, but again, it places the Jews as foreigners. Jews are not foreigners. You go to Judeans, the West Bank, dig in the land, you find our history there too. Now, we spoke about ethnic cleansing of populations being displaced in 48. Jewish populations were from the West Bank, Judean Samaria in 1948, in 1929, and many other times. Now, there was a mention also of roads, certain roads being accessible for some. Take Hebron, which is where this example comes from. 3% of it is accessed by Jews. 97% of it is accessed by Palestinians. So sure, you have 3% that works, but then you have 97% place that Jews and Israel is that the limitation on either side is wrong. But it's not only happening to one side. Now, you said that Israel completely controls the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. Also not true. Area A is completely militarily and municipality controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Does that mean the Palestinian Authority is as strong as it is to control the macro situations of geopolitics as Israel? But it has full control over Area A, Area B, and it doesn't have control over Area C. And even though this is what exists and it is not an apartheid, it is still an unjust system that has to change. And I don't think it has anything to do with some Jews having swimming pools, some Palestinians in the West Bank have mansions. I don't think that has any relevance to the conversation to be able to bring it. And I'll just end with this. I think that regardless of the situation right now and how we got here, the reality is here. And the reality is that Israel does have much more power to change. Whereas the Palestinian Authority, if they wanted to change the situation, they could. If Hamas wanted to change the situation, they couldn't really. The Palestinian people, on top of that, they even saying something different than what Fatah, what the Palestinian Authority says, or something different than what Hamas says, could lead them to being persecuted. And people that I work with have to blur their faces and change voices because they speak of a reality where Jews and Palestinians can live there. And for the more extreme groups that reject the Jews, that's problematic and they put their lives in danger. So I would like to end with the reality that today Israel does have more power, giving it more responsibility to change the structure in order for them to be no more limitation of movement and equality on this land, for us to be able to experience this land with justice, but also to fulfill our aspirations. And it's important not to take that out of the equation because the aspirations of both peoples are different and they actually don't contradict, in my opinion, actually fit right in within together. But the problem is we've never actually sat down and had conversations to understand each other's aspirations and then work to create that, to shift the pop culture amongst the younger generation, which is why I think it's very important for everyone here to understand that regardless of the language, the words that you use, which are very important, but at the end of the day, these are just sounds coming out of your mouth. What really matters, the structure and the specific things that happen in there, which a lot of the things that you said specifically, I agree with, and they have to change, and we need to work to change. So rather than applying a word that to the Israelis means you're demonizing us, let's talk specifically what's happening so Israelis can say, yeah, I agree, that has to be changed. So the effort should be to unite people, to make people use language so that they can understand the specific problems, and less so to use language to demonize or to bring other situations that have nothing to do.
We're going to take one more comment on this topic. So Sazi, allow for another speaker to speak.
Yes, I have. Just off the list, I'm seeing names I'm seeing first.
Okay. You're unmuted, Nonkuleleko.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to point out that I think there's, listening to Rudy, there's more emphasis on the PR of the of Israel and the occupation of Palestine move towards a solution. And him recognizing that there's indigeneity of both people in the group, that people have rights to be in the group, and that people have rights to be on the land. There's indigeneity to the land, and that everyone that there should be a pull towards more harmonious living, as he puts it. Why not a greater move towards one country, one democratic country for all, with the enfranchisement, the full enfranchisement of all people, and not the relegation of people? Because had this started taken, then we would more on not making Israel out to be an apartheid state than there is towards a solution then it seems like there's more PR campaign than there is an actual movement to franchise the people. My question then is, one state for all people, democratic, in which all people are enfranchised and all people get to be full citizens, and there is no slanted right to return that is slanted towards towards Israeli Jews. Is this something that he would be willing to put his name on?
Can I answer that?
Yes, you can. And then we're going to move on to the next question and address panelists who haven't heard from in a while. So address it, then we'll move. Cool.
Sure. It's not my intention to take up more time, and I'll try to respond as quick as possible. So I'd like to first say that I'm not a representative of the state of Israel. I don't have any power. I'm an individual. I'm an activist, and I work on the ground with both peoples. The reason for why you feel that this is more PR campaign conversation is because the entire conversation has been on language and on the term apartheid and what is right and what is wrong in terms of media. So that's why the conversation has focused on that. If you want to have a conversation on what type of work we're doing on the ground to change the structure, to create new solutions, we can have a conversation. If you're talking to me about a solution where we have one civilization, equal rights for all, freedom of movement, of access to property, to resources, and to representation for all people, so that we all experience this land as our home, I absolutely am for it, and that's what I push for. Now, what specific structure has to exist? Very complex, because there are many different ideas out there that have validity. There's an emirate system plan, a federation system plan. There's just extending what Israel is into one state. There are many different ideas, but I don't think that this approach of we're going to come and bring this paper with all the answers and impose it onto the people is the right way of approaching the situation. I think we need a shift of the culture from the bottom up of both people's understanding each other, understanding their narratives, their identities, their histories, acknowledging, for example, the Nakba, acknowledging the connection of the Jewish people to the land, acknowledging a lot of these things that a lot of sides refuse to do, in order for us to build something. And if you want to go to the specifics and the theories that I've developed, I think they're very interesting. I can break down the different federation plan ideas, the different emirate systems, which would base power more on the local level, which is actually important in how people have always governed themselves on the local level, less so on the national level. There are plenty of ideas, but I want, at the end of the day, for the Jewish people, when we are in this land, to feel that this is a Jewish civilization, which doesn't mean it's only for Jews, which doesn't mean it needs to be a religious state, but it expresses our culture. And I want that very same state to be seen as a Palestinian civilization for Palestinians, that in this same society, it expresses the needs of the Palestinians. That is the answer to figuring out, is being able to create something that works, so that at the end of the story that we both live in, there's a success and there's a win on both sides. And that can be done by ending the injustices and seeking to fulfill the aspirations of both peoples.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back to one of the questions we'd left out, just because we have a bit more time than we'd have. So the question I'd like to address, and this is to Reverend Frank Chikane, what do you believe the role of the UN should be in all of this? And how do you think they have fulfilled that role or not fulfilled that role thus far throughout this issue? Okay.
No, ma'am, I wish we had time. I moved where I was. I don't have good lighting. You don't need to see me. I wish we had time, because these subjects are complex. Let me say that part of the problem is that the UN was designed in 1948 by, in the main, the colonizers. Remember, we're colonized. Smarts represented South Africa there, even drafted the preamble of the UN. So it's structured in a way that the powerful can veto anything they don't like. And that's why can't solve the problem of Israel. The UN has limitations of what they can do. Within the Church's Commission on International Affairs, we have put up a sub-commission on the UN, we call it international governance architecture. That our problem is that. So the Secretary General of the UN can't touch the Palestine-Israel matter unless the United States allows it, because the US determines what happens in that region. If you go to North Korea, South Korea, where I visited both sides, and both Koreans want to settle, both Koreans want peace. But if the US does not agree, have it. And then the UN was part of the problem in 1948 when those decisions were made. And so even in Korea, it was part of those decisions. So the UN is act where people have no, they can act, but where the powerful determine what happens, the UN can't do it. And so I think I've learned to accept that the powerful determine what happens. I also just wanted to say, if we have time, I would like us to talk after this. But you see, it's the powerful who determine the limitations in Israel and the occupied areas. The South African white establishment here restricted whites from getting to Soweto. Whites had to get a permit to go to Soweto. Now you can't say we are equals because they are restricted, we are restricted. It's the powerful who determine where you must go, who should go where, and who shouldn't. And I've been there myself. I can't go to the occupied areas without the consent of the Israelis. In fact, I'm convinced if I went now, they're going to stop me from going in there because they control what happens or occupied areas. So the UN has limitations, ma'am, where power, the United States can abrogate all the rules and regulations, can act unilaterally against all agreements that are reached internationally, whether it's in any other place. They would ignore that. And so we are not equal. That's really the story, if I would say so. And that's the limitation. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Okay, the next section, we're going to start by addressing Noam. And that question is, sorry, I'm looking through my notes. The question is basically, how do you think we should best go about engagement in divisive issues as schools? And I'm directing this at you specifically as the youngest panelist. So do you think that this constructive conversation with divisive issues like this amongst youth is the best way to go about it? That's directed at Noam.
Sure, thank you. And my apologies, this is going to be a relatively long answer as I've just have a few other things I'd like to speak to that's been going on in the conversation. But on this topic specifically, most of my time I spend chatting to others, and I also have very personal connections to the question, to the extent that when I was in high school, firstly, friends of mine were bullied out of the school, having pro-Palestinian ideals, and I myself was called a disgrace of the school for my own, actually for asking an IDF soldier what he thought about the state of Gaza. But in any case, all of this, I really appreciate when youth do stand up and begin these kinds of conversations. I think they're extremely important, and I think it's really incredible it has been started by students. Onto then, how do we discuss these kinds of topics, right? And this is one of the things I wanted to say to the media access thing is what we have to understand and what we get stuck on often, I believe, is this idea that any attack on Israel or the state of Israel or even the legitimacy of the Jewish people nation state is immediately anti-Semitic, right? And I want to dispel this immediately. I think in fact, the thing that is anti-Semitic is to assume that all Jews are Zionist. I, as a that believes in Judaism, has taught me about equality and freedom, cannot, in good conscience, hold myself to any sort of connection to Israel. I do not believe it is part of my religious or ethnic background, and it is not part of my Judaism. And so then I think that's the first point of contact for these conversations. Say have a split between discussing an issue and oppressed in a specific area versus discussing like anti-Semitism or Islamophobia as a whole. Once again, I think that we can do this and we do this in other spaces. So just in the same way that we can speak about patriarchy and speak about the ways in which men grow up to be perpetrators, I think we can speak about the way that conscription in Israel leads people to be part of a colonial military. I don't think either of these things have to be an indictment on an entire group of people. Right. The first thing is that we're able to discuss structures without then calling that a personal attack. I think students and youths are in an excellent spot for this. I then just feel the need to said. First of all, I am very grateful to Iman for giving me this platform as she was unable to speak. However, many of us are able to give the kind of context or contextualization that a Palestinian could give. And so I do greatly encourage everyone to go and look at first-hand accounts from Palestinians, which are, it is not available here. The final thing I then want to say, just on this question of a right to determination, well, two more things, apologies. On this idea of like right to defense and right to determination, I do not, I've heard kind of, and just by checking through the chat, I've heard often this thing of Israelis having a right to defense. I do not think that an occupation or a occupier or colonial occupation have a right to defense, right? That is the Palestinians' right to defend their homeland that has been taken away from them. The final thing that I just really feel the need to deal with here is this idea of comparing Hamas or the Palestinian Authority to Netanyahu, right? Or to the Israeli government. What we have to understand is being elected, and there are members of the Israeli government who have said things like, just like mowing your front lawn, this is constant hard work, and if you fail to do so, weeds grow wild and snakes begin to slither around the brush. In context of saying we need to continue to bomb Gaza, otherwise, like the weeds are going to grow too big, right? I think that there is a significant difference between someone who is an elected official and what we may see as liberation movements or what we may see as the acts of an oppressed people. This, once again, is, I feel, important to note because I feel a lot of this discussion around, well, we can't actually know what Palestinians want because the kinds of authorities we have for them don't necessarily speak for them. I feel, once again, whether or not we want to call it apartheid, because this is the context that we best understand to discuss it. If we look then at apartheid, I believe that this is extremely similar rhetoric to the kinds of rhetorics of Black on Black violence, to the kinds of rhetorics that say, well, maybe some of the oppressed people agree with us, but we can't actually hear from them because there's violence within this community, right? I think that it is entirely disingenuous to believe or to say that just because there is a form of, there are bodies within the Palestinian state, although I do not want to call it a state because they do not have sovereignty. I think saying that Hamas, or saying that there are divisions within Palestinian people and saying that that is a reason to not listen to what they need, is the exact same kind of rhetoric that the apartheid state used to try and say, well, for now, since we don't really know what Black people want, we may as well just keep white people in power to keep things settled. Yeah, once again, I really appreciate this opportunity to talk. And if any students do want to talk with me further, I'd be very happy to kind of discuss, specific school projects as well that may be able to go forward.
Thank you so much for that offer and engagement. And it'd be great if you could share your contacts with some students that might want to ask you questions after this session. Well, we'll now be moving on to the Q&A portion of today's discussion. Just to end off, Sassy is going to pick questions from the chat that have come up during the discussion, open for the panel to engage with.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm aware that we are under time pressure in these sort of closing moments. I do see a question here. Some of them are a bit more long-winded. Greg has asked if he can, Greg has asked if he can be unmuted to ask Noam a question. So I'm going to allow for that to happen. Please, would both parties please keep that relatively brief. I'm just, okay, there we go.
Right, can you hear me? Okay, cool. So yeah, thank you for today's lecture and listening to these guest speakers. It's really interesting to learn more and more from each side. So now I'm speeches and you mentioned you've grown up as an Ashkenazi Jew. You went to Jewish school, and you mentioned in your previous point that there were certain individuals at your school who were bullied for being pro-Palestinian. And a lot of the movements that you've associated with have made posts that the Jewish schools in South Africa were taught at an early age that there needs to be developed for a love of Israel, that they were forced to sing the Israeli national anthem, and that it was almost put onto them as kind of like it was forced onto them to love Israel. Now I wanted to ask you, if one is attending a school where parents are sending their kids to a school where they're going to be taught about Jewish values, how can you expect something like Israel to not be incorporated when it's embedded in Jewish history, Jewish culture? And you also mentioned earlier that Ashkenazi be traced back to the land of Israel. And I mean, saying that, I've been looking back at my family history, and past 200 years, I can track back to Poland, Lithuania, Germany, England. But what you kind of failed to mention is that prior to those 200 years, the Jewish people have faced many years of persecution. After we were expelled from, what is today the modern land of Israel, we were sent to places like the Sephardim settled in North Africa, and they were kicked out. In Lithuania, we were persecuted. We were killed in Russia by the pogroms. And then to say that not all Jews are from Judea, I mean, the place is called Judea. It's in the name, Judea, Jews from Judea. I'm really upset, and I'm baffled to understand how you can make a statement like that and say that your view on Zionism and Israel were kind of forced on groups that you associate with, when at the same time you're optioning each other.
Sorry, we're short on time.
Yeah,
Can you summarize the first?
I'm almost done. You know, sent to a school where you are going to be expected to be covering topics like that. I appreciate being unmuted, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
I saw in the chat that I may have a chance to conclude because I have to leave in about 4 minutes because Shabbat is starting here in Israel. Is that
and we'll do closing statements off. You can start.
Okay. Well, for being here, I just want to address a few points very quickly because I'm rushed on time. All of you can also reach out to me on social media, and we can try to have a discussion if you have further questions. If I wasn't able to get to all of them, and I the host for creating this. I know I'll be speaking to Noam later because regardless of our difference in ideologies, we're still family, still the same people, and we have to be able to speak within each other as well as a community. So I would sort of agree with what Greg was trying to present here. No matter what our experience as Jews in the diaspora, we genetically, culturally, historically come from Judea. That's where we come from. I'm sure a lot of people have seen the imagery of Mary breaking a glass in Yom Mazov. The breaking that glass represents the destruction of Jerusalem and the promise that the next generation will one day be able to come back and rebuild Jerusalem. Every Passover, we say next year in Jerusalem. We have a saying in our culture that says, if you forget Jerusalem, make your right hand forget what it's supposed to do. All these elements of our culture are based on a specific land. In fact, we have 613 mitzvot, which are 613 commandments. A large portion of them can only be done in Israel. So to say that Israel is not connected to our people is not correct. The way Israel is created or exists, or the conflict or the state, those are things that we can condemn and say that maybe I disagree with the way things are done or the way things have been created. But to say that the Jews don't have a connection, and to say that one thing is wrong is like telling someone who is Native American and has a connection to their land, or is Tibetan, has a desire to enter Tibet, or is Maori and has a connection to the land, and saying all of us didn't know that their connection isn't there and they don't have a connection. And I'm sure you can find a Tibetan that will say, no, I don't feel any Tibet. It has nothing to do with my culture. But Tibetans are from Tibet. One day they are able to come back and to revive their civilization. Land now called New Zealand, and the Aboriginals are from the land now called Australia, and the Native American tribes and nations are from the land that is today called America. And even if you have individuals within those communities that reject their identity, reject their collective culture, reject their history, reject connection, define the entire people or change the fact that they are from there, and a part of their self-determination is to go back. Now, I noticed a lot of things being done, and I'm going to close it off with this, is that there's always this approach of saying one side is good, one side bad. One side can defend itself, can't. One side has a connection, the other side doesn't. And this is the toxic energy that has allowed us to be in this situation in the first place. Both sides have a right to defend themselves. But terrorism is a tool. It's a tool to cause terror to a people, to a government, or to a military in order to get something. The Jewish people, there were Jewish paramilitary groups before 48 that terrorized the British. They blew up, the oil refineries, bases. They were killing British soldiers, and so they made the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation, leading to the British leaving the land. According to official British records, it is because of Jewish terrorism that they left the land. So terrorism can be used as a tool against colonizers. However, when this tool is being used against Israeli civilians, intentionally to kill civilians, and one could argue that there are terrorist and extreme groups on both sides, and I would, when they're trying to use this tactic of terrorizing, and let's call it what it is, it's not terrorism, it is when you're targeting at Israeli civilians, there's no excuse for it. There's no reason to ever target civilians, and it won't change the situation, because when you use anti-colonial tactics against indigenous people, just so happen to be 100 times stronger than you, the only way they're going to react is 100 times stronger. So anti-colonial tools work against colonizers, not against foreigners. So it's important to understand that neither population are foreigners. They are both from this land. We are both connected to this land, and we will both exist on this land. And we have to be able to by having we are, being able to change the structure, but to never make it one side is good, one side is bad, one side has the right to defend itself, the other side doesn't, to be able to change that situation. I'm sorry I can't stay on longer. I do appreciate being given time, and the other panelists also for engaging in intellectual and respectful conversation. You know, halavai, which is a word in Hebrew. I wish there was more like this in this modern day of people to engage with each other. And I thank you all for being able to have this conversation and to be here and to participate. So thank you so much. And Shabbat is starting in 1 minute, so I have to go.
Okay, so Jad, thank you, Rudy, for your time. So what we're going to do from here on, I know we're over time, but please bear with us as we conclude. What we're going to do is have Noam answer the question that was asked, and then would you please also just do your concluding remarks? And then we're going to direct one more question from the pool of audience questions to Jamie, and then could you also then include your concluding remarks? And then we'll let the Reverend Chikane have his concluding remarks, and then Kayedi will conclude the session as a whole. Thank you, everybody.
Sure.
Okay.
So,
thank you, Rudy, for saying your conclusion, and we'll move on. Sorry.
So I want to first.
Sorry.
Sure. So I want to first discuss this thing of how can I be a proud Jew and not believe in the state of Israel. The first thing I want to say is that there are Jews in Israel that very much believe that having a secular Israeli state is overtly against the Jewish land, right? Or overtly against the Testament. And so there are many sects within Judaism that are overtly against a Zionist secular state in Israel. But furthermore, right, a couple of specific prayers spoken about in terms of next year in Jerusalem, next year in the Third Temple. There are many, as in almost everything with Judaism, there are many interpretations of these. I see these as a metaphorical messianic Israel, right? And I believe that that is quite actively the intention of these texts, is to speak about. So after Passover, we say next year in Jerusalem, even if you're in Jerusalem, right? I think that that says that what we're speaking to really is next year in a future that we can exist in. I, as a queer Jew, have to be able to reinterpret the Torah in specific ways, right? Because just as the school I went to very explicitly was extremely pro-Zionist in a way that isn't speaking about a religious spot, but rather is bringing a foreign nation's military into my school and forcing me to say the national anthem of a foreign state, right? That isn't religious, that's cultural. So in the same ways that that kind of school told me specific things about Zionism, it also told me specific things about who I'm supposed to love and who I'm supposed to be that, once again, are not part of my Judaism. I want to also then say that I find this point of whether or not at some point a piece of my DNA can be traced to Jerusalem extremely moot. Purely because that's not how any other nation state works, right? Like the right of return, the fact that I have the right to return to a nation that I or none of my that I can back to have sort of as people who live there today cannot get citizenship, right? That is what I'm about when I say that there is an unjust power. So it doesn't, I as myself do not see state as part of my, I believe that the right of return is made to systematically oppress Palestinians and remove them from their land because Palestinians cannot get the same kinds of rights in Israel as I can, as someone who has never lived there. And finally, I mean, just on a semantic thing, even in the Old Testament, there's places where this place is called Palestine, right? I a word for it that it is compelling. And so sure, like at no point do I want to deny that this is culturally important to Jews, if not many Jews. However, if you're using a cultural importance to then say that you're able to terrorize people in Gaza and the West Bank, if you're using cultural importance then to bomb shelters, right? And bomb, again, not as a rogue group, but as the official state. If you're using this idea of culture to maim and debilitate a nation, that is not part of my Judaism, and that is not something that myself or other anti-Zionist Jews want to represent our Judaism, a Judaism we believe to be beautiful and peaceful. I thank everyone for their engagement. I very much, I'm very happy to speak to more people in the South African Jewish community in particular, as I do believe that there is a genuine feeling that we need Israel for security, and that is a feeling I respect. However, I just do not think that any of that outweighs the human rights atrocities that Palestinians are facing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your input. No, the last question that we're going to have, I'm going to direct it to Jamie, and then would you also please include your concluding remarks, and then we'll hear concluding remarks from Reverend Chikane. So the question here is, let me just read through it. Somebody would like to get an opinion on the role of schools during this time. Number one, should schools specify what their stance is? And number two, do the speakers believe students should be able to actively voice their viewpoint, especially from a pro-Palestinian viewpoint? And secondly, and then thirdly, is it wrong for schools to silence those who take a specific stance with the reason of quote unquote preventing polarization within school communities? So if you do have some input on that, it would be fantastic. Thank you.
Great. So I think that as a principal, I'm not a fan or a supporter of indoctrination. I think that schools should facilitate critical thinking, and even critical thinking that is contrary to the values and philosophies of that particular school. The role of an educator is not to drill thoughts into somebody, but to give them the tools that think for themselves what the school thinks. You try to do your best to help people develop their character, but ultimately that's in the hands of each of us. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, I don't think that schools necessarily should take a position in times and issues like this that can be quite problematic. I think it's fine for a school to have a value system and even to be a, but I think for them to take a position on a foreign policy issue becomes quite complex. I wouldn't be in favor of. Lastly, I think that there shouldn't be any repercussions or any persecution of students who disagree with the conventional wisdom of the community, be it a school, church, or whatever the case may be. I think we ought to facilitate and have healthy discourse, respectful discourse, similar to what we've been having here, but we shouldn't necessarily curtail anybody's opinion, articulations of those opinions. And schools should do more to become more embracive of the dissenting opinion, because oftentimes that is where high quality conversation comes from. The consensus opinion, generally you don't progress in society by accepting a consensus opinion. It's when you engage with the tough opinions, with the pushback from students, that you begin to develop and generate necessarily see eye to eye. So you want to facilitate people progressing a community, and that happens generally at points of dissent, points of confrontation, and there has to be a certain amount of disagreement, which is intended. I'm using it here in an academic sense, not just being an a-hole, but disagreeability in the sense of channeling, your different opinions. So I would say that the only thing I would caution is, as young people interact with this topic, is not to vilify people who disagree with you. People's views change, people's views mature, and sometimes people's understanding on topics actually may be different to yours. So if you are encountering people who disagree with you, and they're not doing so from a place of evil, and they're not doing so from a place of arrogance and power, I think that doors should always be open to conversation. That's not to place an obligation to educate the other. What I'm simply trying to put across is that they can sometimes be in force. This labeling them and us, and these are, the villains, and these are the good people, and so on. And in a school setting, particularly, because I think it may be fair to do that in civil arts, dealing with adults and people who are committed to their causes and their opinions. But in a school setting, I think there should be some caution, just so that you don't harm the school culture and the community. But broadly speaking, I think that I lean in a direction that allows for discourse to curtails it. And that can also be my closing statement. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for your input today. Lastly, Reverend Chikane, please would you close us off?
Let me just say a few things. Firstly, thank you, Bongwe and Kaeji Hama for facilitating this process. I didn't know what to expect, but it has been a great engagement. Secondly, it's just the attitude of respecting each other, which is of critical importance, and listening to one another. Let me make a number of comments. Firstly, I didn't participate in the issue about media and the way they conduct conversations. If you watched what happened in the United States during the last elections, if you looked at CNN, it's one story. You look to Fox, it's another. And people in the United States get compartmentalized. They don't listen to the other, but they stay in the country. And they don't understand why others think the way in which they think, because they've never tried to understand them. In South Africa, when they put in that whites must not go to Soweto, it's to make whites be as ignorant as they could. And the leader of my church was white before we, and the white leader of the white section, said to me after unity, I didn't believe you were tortured. I thought you were. And now, because I know you and we have engaged each other, I can understand and believe terrible things might be. So as long as if you've got this demarcation, not interacting with each other, that means you would never come in a sense. If you say the rocket fell here and people become victims, and then when it falls the other side, they celebrate. And so we need to move to a completely different construct. And the different construct at school level and university is to have the freedom to think, access information. The facilitators must enable everybody to be exposed to every thinking, so that they can make their choices about what is right, what is wrong. And there's been a lot of talk here about taking, some of us get accused of taking sides, etc. I always say, if you take the side of justice, you can't make a mistake. So my measuring stick is it just to treat the Palestinians the way they are being treated? And the answer will be no. And would the Jewish community want to be treated the way in which the Palestinians are treated? The answer will be no. They will fight and kill everybody. they can't allow anything to happen to them. So if we use the concept of, I don't want to be biblical, they call it the golden rule, that do unto others as you would that they do to you. Don't do anything to anybody you don't want that person to do to you. For me, that's the measuring stick. If we measure it in that way, we'll break down the walls in Israel-Palestine, we'll let people return. When people talk about we have the right to return, they mean a particular group of people. The others don't have the right to return. Even in the Oslo agreements, can you have the refugees return to their homes? They say no. So in Jordan, there are refugees, types of refugees, 48, 67, etc., and so forth. The last thing I want to say is that I've said when I was there in Israel, that I love the Israelis as human beings. So they are human beings we can't treat them as less than human beings. We can't wish them the worst, but they can't expect that you then agree with the injustices. Then you become anti-Semitic. I think that's really the issue for me. The solution is very easy, in my view. Just look at justice, which is indivisible. You can't have justice for whites and not for blacks, or for blacks and not for whites. And I want to end by referring to my experience as Sazi and Kaej, that before 1990, I made a statement in Durban, it's still on record, to say if Black people took over this country and did what whites did to us, I'll go to jail again. Because for me, it's not whether you are white or Black, it's the issue of justice. And that must be the only measuring stick we should use when we deal with Israel-Palestine. And if we did that, we'll have peace tomorrow. And so I would like to thank you. I think my view, it's even against my own religious tradition. I say to them, theology justice other people, then it's not my God. God can't brutalize other people. If it is God, it must be God for those who are brutalized as well, because God can be sectarian. It's not a tribal God. It's about the people as a whole, the reality. Thank you very much. I can say this and say, God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of the speakers that spoke today. And thank you to all of the remaining attendees that have stayed with us even over time. I'm happy and I agree with ideas that were brought up earlier by Noam about how important it is, and by Jamie about how important it is to have these types of engagements amongst youth. And being said, I hope we can have more discussions like this as we are faced with more issues as youth. And I hope that this engagement continues even after this discussion ends, as it is doing. And I'll close off by simply saying, once again, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.